Good morning, and welcome to the Sunday Times GenNext digitized series. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with some incredibly talented and bright marketers. And what we will be doing today is having a fascinating discussion about how is it that we can better connect and understand what it is that young people are looking for. The Sunday Times GenNext digitized series is done in partnership with Yellowwood as well as with the headline partner, Train. So thank you to both of those partners. My name is Refilwe Maluleke. I'm the managing director of Yellowwood, and I will be facilitating today's discussion. In terms of a bit of background, so the Sunday Times GenNext, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is now in its 17th year, if you can actually believe it. And it's been the leading annual brand preference and consumer behavior research on youth. The GenNext, which is run by Yellowwood, provides meaningful insights into the minds of South African youth to help brands better connect with them. Now, what we will be doing today is really having a discussion, as I said earlier, around how brands can meaningfully connect with South African youth and effectively be able to build their brands. We'll be hearing from brand and industry leaders who have managed to do just that, and whose success in understanding and speaking to young South Africans is proven by them having secured the top accolade in the 2020 GenNext Brand Preference Survey. Now, I could never do justice to this incredible lineup of people that we have, so I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. And I think we will start with one of our junior board of director members, Bonolo Masukume. So Bonolo, if you could please introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about the Bonolo Sisterhood Club.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Bonolo Masukume, and I am currently head girl at Cura Academy Mamelodi. I am a ambassador for Ace Models Pretoria East, and I am a finalist for Miss Teen of South Africa, just to get a look of that.
Congratulations.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm about to launch my sisterhood club in a few weeks' time, which basically focuses on climate change, tourism, the environment, women empowerment, GBV, etiquette, professionalism, and so many things. So basically this program is going to, as I've learned a lot of skills from things that I've done, I'd like to educate other girls who want to know more and share a space with them, build a sisterhood relationship with them, because I believe as women, we need to stand together to help each other. And it starts at a young age. We can't bring each other down because we're all we have. So I want to help young ladies who want to conquer the world, and just as young ladies. So that's what my sisterhood focuses on. And more information will be posted on my social media networks. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Bonolo. My introduction. That's basically who I am.
Thank you so much.
I'm also a junior board of director at Yellowwood. I do not add that.
That's okay. I think what is important is that actually, so Bonolo is here as the voice of young people. It would be somewhat pointless to have a discussion about them without hearing directly from them. And I think your introduction is indicative of some of the opportunities and challenges inherent in understanding young people and the complexity of their lives. I'm going to ask Zukiswa to introduce herself next. And after you've introduced yourself and your role, can you tell us just one thing that you think remains true of young people across generations?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Zukiswa Motisakeng. I'm at Telkom in the brand communication and consumer segment space. I think when it comes to the youth, we find that they want, especially when it comes to brands, they're looking for the authentic brands. I think especially in the South African context, they're looking for brands that speak their truth and also not try and push some of the products to them, but also try and help them, especially in this context with COVID right now. They're looking for brands that could help them whether they want to start their businesses or help them when it comes to their studies. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zikiso. And that point about looking for brands that make a difference in their lives is definitely something we are going to discuss as we move through the rest of the call. Thank you. Next, I'd like to go to Thabisa. Thabisa, could you introduce yourself and answer a similar question? There's often the sense that young people today are just fundamentally different from any other generation. And I'm quite curious to hear from you if there is anything that you think actually doesn't change with young people, regardless of whether we're looking at the 1950s or today.
Morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I am Thabisa Mkhwanazi. I head up marketing at awesome brand DSTV. I'm incredibly passionate about storytelling, incredibly passionate about content, and then about our continent and the youth. I think, Griff, the question you asked is an incredible one. I think there'll always be similarities purely because of the transition you go through at that life stage. So whether you go through your youth in the 50s or in the 60s or in the 90s, as I did, or now, what fundamentally remains the same is you're at a place and a mindset space where you're working out who you are. You're working out what the future is going to look like for you. You're trying to make sense of the past. And so I think that will always be constant. This kind of space where you process the world from the past and the context of where you come from. And so I think when we come closer to home and speak of South African youth, different to when I grew up, right? The youth now are trying to make sense of post-apartheid in democracy, 25 years. They were born into democracy, so they're trying to make sense of this past that feels a little distant to them. They're trying to make sense of what they want in the future. And then in the current context, they're looking at COVID, they're looking at, the various movements around the world. And so I think that will always be constant. I think the elements they deal with will change, but this idea that when you're in that space of youth, your world is made up of trying to make sense of the past, trying to live and thrive in the present, and then set yourself up for the future. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you. And I think that's going to be an important part of the discussion that we're going to have shortly. Next, I'd like to go to Doug, who is definitely a very familiar face in these webinars. In fact, Doug, I have a sense that you probably spend a good 30% of your time in different webinar discussions. So I'm going to ask Doug to introduce himself. And my question for you, Doug, is what do you think is the most difficult thing about connecting with young people as a brand?
Yeah, hi, good morning. Thank you. Yeah, it doesn't quite feel like 30%, but it's been fun sharing some. I'm here to steal, if I'm honest. Some brilliant minds on this call, and there's going to be some brilliant questions, I'm sure, a little bit later. So I'm here to steal all of your gold. That's why I'm here. It's the rare privilege of heading up Nando's, which is such an exciting brand, not just here in South Africa, but increasingly around the world. And what we're seeing more and more is, young people in particular, quite burned out by Western brands. They're quite burned out by certainly very Western, sort of overly materialistic capitalism. And I'm a big fan of capitalism. Like, we're all here because of it. So let's be certain. But there's a side effect to anything, and I think young people in particular are a little bit done with the inauthenticity, I think one of the earlier speakers said earlier. So I think young people in South Africa in particular have a raw deal, man. They've been told for a long time by very senior people from the presidency to brands that the future is for them. They have the right to free education. They have the right to grow and express themselves, and the future is theirs. And they've got all these big and important promises, and almost all of them have been unfulfilled. And frankly, like, quite why we don't have more fees must fall protests and similar expressions of discontent and protest. I think, I don't know who said it, was probably one of the Beatles, but protest is the voice of the unheard. And so young people are generally, I think, very frustrated that the disconnect between that which was promised and that which has been delivered is this widening chasm. And, the world is not a friendly place. And it's not just COVID that's reinforced that. There's plenty of things out there which are not predisposed to our well-being. And young people are particularly vulnerable to those kinds of systemic shocks. And, I think marketers treat the youth as a subsegment of the country. It's like 2/3 of South Africa are under the age of 18. Like, this is the country. And these people will be voting soon. I mean, in a matter of months, and deciding what does it mean to take responsibility and control of their future. And so, brands, if they're approaching it from the perspective of how can I get the youth's money, right? How can I access that spending power, and have a very kind of cynical approach to it, are going to get a clap. You're just going to, because the youth aren't dumb, right? They know that you're after the bucks. They know that you disappeared when COVID came because you wanted to save your marketing money and only pitch up when you had money to spend. And so to stay constantly empathetic, I think, is the biggest opportunity, not just for brands, but for business and society in general. I mean, the total lack of empathy is the perfect recipe for chaos. And the reason I'm here is to try and avoid that chaos as best we can. And I think it's more about that a little bit later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Doug. Definitely a very insightful view on some of the challenges facing young people. And with that, I'd like to go to our last panelist for today, who is Yatish. So Yatish, if you can introduce yourself, and really it's a build from what Doug was talking about. If it's that young people are looking for empathy, for brands that make a difference, what do you think are some of the most powerful ways that brands can really tap into that need?
How's it, everyone? So yeah, my name is Yatish. I'm from Grid. It's always, even when I read through the kind of topic for the webinar, it grates me a little, and I guess it picks up on Doug's point about going, the worst question in the world is how do I, even when I see the word target youth, it just like I can't stand the actual term, right? It's ultimately, and I suppose it picks up a little bit with some of the other comments about journey from the past to the future, whatever. If you think about, if you want to understand youth, for me, always, even just looking at my kids, right? What you start to appreciate is that any journey growing up is really, it's a journey for access, right? So, when you're small, you learn to speak so that you can access the people around you. You learn to walk so you can access physical things. And as youth get older, really their biggest protest is accessibility, right? They want to be able to access the world in various ways that they've been locked out of. And what's happening, which I think is becoming interesting, is as our population grows, and if I think of it as a little funnel, right, that the back end, which is the people looking for access to the world, have been slowly growing generation by generation, right? So the quantum of youth to existing has increased over time. And that's probably something I think we haven't really thought about and dealt with, and it's probably what we're seeing. And that's going to be something to really, really think about. So movements like Fees Must Fall, et cetera, all of these things, even the comment earlier about going, I like that brand because they're affordable, they're all things about accessibility. And so really, I think for a brand to do well with youth, first thing is to understand youth are just young people. So first, just put that out of your mind, that they're not a segment. These are just people that are younger. And so what they need is the opportunity to access things. And as a brand, how are you playing a role in providing them with access? That's really what you've got to be thinking about, trying to target them. No, I think that's the wrong way to go about it.
So we're going to stop using the word target, and we're going to focus on connection and making a meaningful impact. And thank you, Yatish. And I'd like to go to Bonolo, actually. And really what I'd like to ask you is, in response to what Yatish is saying, that it fundamentally is about access. I'd love to hear your perspective on that need, and really to find out if the last year, which has been different to any other year that any of us have experienced in the context of COVID, has that fundamentally changed that need and desire for access?
I don't think it has, because we still do want access. We still do want to be accessed, because during the lockdown, we experienced things like depression, anxiety. We felt isolated. So which even makes it a bigger deal for us to actually want access. We want people to understand us. We feel lost. We don't feel understood. So, and also on the positive side, I do think that young people learned so much. They started new businesses. They learned hidden talents. They want to interact with more things. They want to better themselves. They learned life lessons. So I think it goes both ways. But everything has changed, I must say, since the COVID lockdown.
And I think that's a very interesting point about wanting to be able to know what is out there and what is possible. And I think I'd like to actually bring that question to Thabisa, right? So having been voted the coolest delivery platform, which is no mean feat because you were outperforming kind of giants like YouTube and Netflix and Amazon and all of those kinds of things. Your business and your platform is fundamentally about access and a world of possibilities, I guess. What do you think it is about your platform and what it is that you do and the role that you play in the lives of South African youth that has allowed you to have this kind of impact with young people?
Thanks, Rib. So I think it's, I'd probably say it's twofold, right? We do have an incredible platform. And in its very nature, it's wired, and in its very DNA, it's built to give people access to the best in local stories, international stories, and sporting stories. So fundamentally, what holds it together and what youth connect to is the stories that we bring before them. I think our ability to curate the way that we do is absolutely incredible and probably is a big part of what we do. Probably, though, the anchor of it all is really this idea of local storytelling. I think we have fully transformed, and we tell their story, and they're able to see themselves in the story. They're able to see other stories. And I guess to what I was saying earlier, they're able to make sense of the world that they are in through the different pieces of content that they're able to consume. Some of the cool stuff we've been able to do, though, which I think was a great first, is we created a meme bank using local content, using the DSTV Prem content, using some international content, which allows us to weave ourselves in conversation and to really engage with young people. I think, again, I agree with the rest of the panel that fundamentally, I guess, our approach as an industry has been flawed for a while. Of youth as that segment you kind of bolt on when you're looking for additional growth spaces, to actually they're 2/3 of the population, and they are young people. They are part of a consumer set. So I think for us, the focus has really been on storytelling. It's been on local storytelling, particularly allowing them to see themselves in their current world, allowing them to see themselves in the rest of the world, and literally kind of lifting boundaries, telling great, incredible stories around sport, which are always human stories. So if I look at something like Chasing the Sun, which is the story of the Springboks winning the World Cup, it allowed people to connect in such a human way. And we saw a lot of young people following that story, and some of them don't watch rugby, but they were able to connect with it. So that for us has been a big thing, is enabling storytelling. We've got Talent Factory that allows young people to tell the stories themselves. And that also has really propelled us in understanding the type of stories, the type of content, how far we can push the content, because I think often we have a group of quite conservative older people trying to figure out what young people want. And I think as soon as we let that go and really brought them in and made them part of informing the stories that we tell, we've found that we're able to connect a lot better.
Thank you very much. And I think to tee up this question to Doug, I think it's wonderful to focus on things like access and the conversation we've been having so far about, how is it that we can make a meaningful difference in the lives of young people? How can we really acknowledge and understand the context in which they are living? I think is incredibly important. And one of the brands that does that incredibly well is Nando's, right? Because you've historically been able to do a great job of bearing in mind this context and yet being able to deliver something that is quite meaningful. The question I'd like to ask, and I think it's something that's often at the forefront of marketers that are aiming to engage with young people. How do you find the balance between, yes, something with meaning and purpose and all of those really important things, but you've got to sell the chicken at the end of the day? How do you find the balance between those two things?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. I think marketing, when it's done well, regardless of the industry, is a response to a need, and as opposed to, and this can come through quite a bit in a lot of webinar content that I've seen, is like, well, we have something, how do we make people buy it? It's like, well, you can't make people do things they don't want to do. Almost impossible. It's really difficult. And young people like eating nice things. Like, who doesn't? You know? And so you don't make people buy Nando's. It's like, well, we have the best flame grilled chicken in the whole world. Like, we really believe that. We can prove that scientifically. You know, there's plenty of ways which you can justify that. And so making that available and accessible for people to buy is responding to an innate need. And, the ways in which we do that better than anybody else, because we're proud of this product. Now, it's expensive chicken. I'll say it. You don't have to say it to me. I get it, because it's South African chicken. It's not frozen. It's made by trained professional grillers. It's made with ingredients that most of which we grow and source ourselves. 95% of our supply chain is South African, which means that when the Suez Canal thing happens, we're okay. We don't have stuff that's stuck there. And so all of those things are intrinsically true to who we are. And I think young people, respond to that because we respond to them. So I would ask yourself, like, what's the deeply unmet need? And that could be obvious, or it could be less obvious. And so, a lot of what we do, particularly, we get asked a lot around, how do we make adverts or communications or tweets the way we do? And to be honest, we're just saying back what we're already hearing. We're not particularly creative in that regard, but we'll say it back in our own sort of tone of voice, the same way you would when you talk to your friends on Twitter or WhatsApp. So you'll do it in your own way, and being participative and humble in that is something which I think people know when they're being sold to versus when they're having a deeply unmet need addressed. And that need could be entertainment, it could be healthcare, it could be food, it could be transportation. All of those are very real needs. And if you can meet them in a way which is accessible for people, there's a value exchange. They'll pay you to solve a problem for them. And in return, you generate economic value for yourself as a business. You generate societal value by solving problems. And this growing disconnect, disenfranchisement, and cynicism that capitalism is just there to accumulate wealth for the minority, it starts to dissipate. And you say, well, actually, everybody can win here. Like, truly, everyone can win. So this idea of shared value, as opposed to greenwashing, or we're going to pretend to care by having a few isolated events of care. But when it's intrinsically baked into your business, and that's expensive and hard to do, man, believe me, like, we could make a lot more standards than we currently do, but there are things that are more important to us than making money, definitely. And that's why we work for such a cool brand, and it's an honor and a privilege, and it's hard, but that's what a meaningful life is.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go to Zukiswa for the next question, because one of the benefits, I guess, that Doug has is that the Nando's brand has been incredibly strong for a very, very long time. And while that doesn't mean his job is easy, because that kind of pressure to continue building a great brand is pressure, but I guess that's a pressure that's a privilege. And Zukiswa, you work for a company that actually has had to overcome a relatively tarnished reputation in the past. And so it is, in fact, I think, a phenomenal achievement to be able to be seen as the coolest brand in a category that is very, very competitive with other very, very big spenders. And so the question that I'm actually wanting to ask you, which is actually from the audience, is that, what are some of the most effective strategies in coming back from a brand that has been tarnished reputationally, and really building something that's meaningful? And what they've actually asked is, so what are those strategies, and how can that be applied to local governments? I know.
Okay, I'll first talk about from where Telkom is coming from. I think one of the things about our brand promise is to leave no man behind. And with that brand promise, we've laid that as a foundation, and we've developed value proposition that speaks to that. So earlier we spoke about connectivity, especially with the youth. So what we've done is we've developed value propositions, including the youth segment. I know Yatish said there are no segments. We look at the youth as a segment. So we have developed products like LTE broadband, and also I think one of our most popular products is the Free Me, which is what Bonole had mentioned earlier. It actually gives more value to customers. So in that, recognizing what the customer wants and also what the customer needs, we have developed those offers. Sorry, I'm at the office. We have developed those offers, and we also working more and more in terms of developing propositions that speaks to the strategies that speak to the youth, especially with Telkom One, rich gaming and content products. Coming back to the strategies and what government could apply, I think first of all is to listen to what customers want. We do a lot of research in terms of understanding all our customer segments and trying to develop propositions that will speak to those to those needs. And I think that's how the government could work, because I think if we looking at more and more what the communities are saying with the strikes and delivery, non-delivery of services, and also because that's what the communities are looking for, and they feel that the government is not answering to their needs. I think they need to start there. Thank you.
Thank you, Zikisa. Yes, I'd like to come to you with a relatively similar question, not specifically about government, but when you are looking at a brand that has struggled kind of reputationally and they haven't necessarily been able to connect with young people, they've lost relevance with that audience. What do you think are some of the most fundamental things to do in order to be able to turn that ship around?
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think it always has to start with, and I'll steal the name of your platform, right? Next, it has to start with, I think, like some really, really simple fundamental questions. So I'll also, let me just spice things up in the interest of heat, disagree with Doug completely, in that it's not expensive to build a business the way he describes. In fact, it's expensive not to. Like, it's in the long term, you simply will not survive if you don't think with that level of sort of fundamentals in place. And the fundamentals really are what you've got to ask yourself in crisis, before crisis, through crisis, and after is, is what you're doing best for what comes next or who comes next, right? In every way, shape, or form. And I think if you're constantly engaged with that question, not how do I pull myself out of the crap I'm in, or how do I turn the tide on this? It's just ask yourself the basic question is, what do I do now that's going to benefit who and what comes next? And I can apply that lens to sustainability, to my product, to my service, to anything I do. And so if you take that lens of, again, I mean, there's, Larry Fink's letters every year are always fascinating, the CEO of BlackRock. So he controls the largest equity fund in the world, and shareholder and letter after letter after letter, he talks about purpose as kind of the long-term engine of profitability, right? That you cannot decouple these two things because it's a sustainability thing. And so if you do things that are well intended, ultimately, I guess, the more value you add, the more valuable you become, right? And so if you're looking to extract value back, whether that's from a reputation perspective, whether that's from an earnings perspective, whatever that might be, the value you seek back, I think, is related to the value you then want to commit. So I suppose the answer for me then would be simple, is I guess is to stop what you're doing and just revert to the fundamental questions of, how am I adding value? How could I add value? And in the space I'm talking to, and the value will surely be returned.
Thank you. Yes, and I'd actually like to put the question then to Bonolo actually on that. So if we are saying, or rather if Yatish is saying that, it really is about the value that brands add into your specific life. And in that turn, that's how you actually start to create more meaning and get value back as a brand. What is the brand, and you can pick 2 or 3 if it's easier than one, that you think has added the most value to your life? And perhaps let's focus in on the last year, so it's a defined period. Bonolo, are you still on the line? Let me just check. She might have dropped off. You are on the line, but you're on mute. There you go.
Okay. So I'd mention the first brand I'd like to mention is Adidas, because Adidas used a very good way to reach out to young people. As young people, we love things like sports and music. If I don't know if you guys have heard, most young people would say music, they live for music. Music is what keeps us going. So Adidas mixed music and sports together to create the brand. And this is why the brand is successful. And this is why we are into initiatives and campaigns that Adidas makes, and then we engage with them. And also Dove as well. Dove focuses on body confidence and self-esteem, which is a brand that I honestly relate to, because as a young person, I face things like self-image problems, challenges that come with peer pressure, challenges that come with confidence. So Dove really did do a great thing. And I also think brands should really take stands, because as young people, we're going to follow a brand that takes stands instead of a brand that actually doesn't take stands. It's more meaningful. It relates more to us. We're facing so many challenges, and we need something to pull us up, to motivate us, to relate to us. So I think those 2 brands. Another brand that I'd also mention, I'm not sure when this took place, but the Coca-Cola #ShareACoke I think that was a very, very great campaign, because they replaced the Coca-Cola name on the other side of the bottle with #ShareACoke and the person's name. And their sales grew very high. And I think it was a great idea, because if my mom goes to the mall now, Pick n Pay, Woolworths, or wherever, and she sees a Coke saying #ShareACoke with Bonolo, she's going to buy it, right? And she's not going to buy an 8-pack or a 24-pack, but she's going to buy different Cokes with different names. So that was a very great initiative. And about 600,000 posts were made up to date on Instagram about the #ShareACoke which also shows that it was all over social media. All we wanted to do, as we love social media so much, we'd post #ShareACoke with who, #SharingACoke with this person. So I think that was also a very, very good brand initiative as well.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting, because the value add that you've spoken about, to use Yats's words, is quite focused on some of the storytelling that you've seen. And Doug, I'd like to go over to you with this question. So there's kind of 2 components to this. What is the value that you're adding in people's lives, right? There's absolutely in the storytelling piece, but what we've seen in the last couple of years, and it's kind of reflected in the people who are winning awards at Cannes and those kinds of things. It's about the brand actions, right? What are you doing to add value in people's lives? So if we think about Nando's, your storytelling is 100% clear, and most people have mentioned how great that is. What is it that your brand does from a brand action point of view to add value? And have you seen that make a fundamental difference in how your brand performs?
Yeah, absolutely. So brand activism is a real thing, and it's hard to do. It's easy to bandwagon, and there's a lot of brands that do this. So, when you see, let's call it media attention to, I don't know, gay rights or the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, there were a lot of brands that sort of said, yeah, we stand in solidarity with you. It's like, well, what does that actually mean? Does it, Bill Bernbach, I love Uncle Bill, said, a value is not a value unless it costs you something. So, it does have to cost you something. But from an Nando's perspective, there are a couple of things, and a few things are really interesting, because a few years back, before Coke did their name thing, we did ours, which was this sort of hashtag write my name, which is that most names in the world are not English names and therefore aren't recognized by spell check. So including Nando's and including our signature ingredient, peri peri. So we just invited, starting with our staff and then, extended it to the country, an opportunity to put your name into a database, which we made freely available that anyone could download. So when you type your name, Bonolo, it doesn't have a little like red line underneath. And at the time, we reached out to major software brands, big American brands. So listen, we don't really have credibility. We're not really a software company, but this is a thing we can fix. And so can you just partner with us? Like, just so people believe this is a real thing. And they couldn't have been less interested, honestly. And we said, we don't want your money. We don't like this. There's nothing for you at stake here. But can you just endorse the fact that this is a real database and a real problem? And they wouldn't even come to meetings, and they were bored and disinterested and frankly arrogant. Now, I promise you those brands are unlikely to survive the next 20 years. They just can't. I mean, how can you possibly ignore something that means so much to people? That campaign, we had almost 100,000 names in 3 weeks, and we didn't advertise this. This is, again, responding to a need that, like, when, it's nonsense, frankly, that my name is not recognized by so-called progressive 21st century software. We put people on the moon, but they can't get my name right. And that thing continued into Botswana and Bangladesh and other sort of Nando's territories, as a campaign. Now, we're running a campaign at the moment, which on the anniversary of COVID, which literally no one's celebrating, and rightfully so, or the lockdown, we know a lot of South Africans rushed out last year and bought tin goods because the end is nigh. And frankly, most of them were my people who did the same thing in 1994 as well. So this is familiar ground. And they bought a bunch of things because the apocalypse was nigh, and there was going to be a food shortage, and I don't know, weirdly a toilet roll shortage as well. And here we are a year later, and we haven't eaten any of those baked beans, or very few of them. Now, we're dealing with the youth crisis where most, particularly, I'm talking about really young people here, like school kids, just aren't getting fed because they're not in schools. So the feeding programs from government and other NGOs can't access them like they used to, so they're hungry. And that's inexcusable. That's nonsense that people have pantries full of uneaten goods and kids are going hungry. So we have this campaign at the moment called Tins for Chips, which is on the Nando's app. You can swap out the thing you don't really want to eat, baked beans or pilchards or whatever, for a free side of Nando's chips. We'll collect the tin from you when we bring the food, and we'll take that tin to hungry kids who need it most via our supply chain network. Now, that's not virtue signaling. That's solving a real problem. It's also solving a real business problem for us. It's getting people to use our app and buy our products. And we're not pretending otherwise. This is a charity initiative. This is a shared value initiative. Everybody wins from this. The consumer wins, the hungry kids win, and Nando's wins. So I think the more the brands can start to do things like that, and the way that we track its success was, did people actually do it? So there's value in action rather than value in just claiming something. And when you ask people, is Nando's a brand that cares about more than profit? Like, more than 80% of people agree with that statement. It's like, Nando's cares about me, not just my wallet. And so being able to keep that trajectory over time is something we're deeply, deeply passionate about. And I mean, we get brand FOMO all the time. Believe me, we look at the Doves of the world and the work that they do with tremendous envy, and that's good. FOMO should move the world forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Doug. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and the first one, actually, Tabby, is for you, and it's a question from Jay. The brands on this webinar, so obviously including DSTV, are very successful in the local space, right? And it's been mentioned that local storytelling is a focus, right, and a key driver of some of that success. Do you take any learnings from international trends and competition, and what are some of those?
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. definitely. I mean, guys, we live in a world that is a world, right? And I think as much as part of our magic and our superpower is understanding the local context, I think similar to Doug and some of the other players in the market, firstly, at DSTV, we're fortunate to be in 50 markets across the continent. So that's the first place we learn a lot from. Very few brands that are homegrown are able to say that we are actively, kind of building content, connecting with consumers, over 20 million across the continent. That kind of puts us in the top 8 in the world of pay TV players. And so immediately that forces us to look across our borders and kind of say, what can we learn? I'm a big believer. One of the things I fundamentally live by, Jay, is something I was taught by a former CEO, which is life is not school, you get to cheat. And I loved it when Doug said he's on here to cheat, because I'm on here to cheat. And how well you do is really based on, we go through life being taught, don't look at the person next to you, sit at your desk, kind of write your test, and you go through whether university or whatever else, right? And actually, then you get to real life, and real life is really based on how well you cheat. And so we definitely look across the world. We look at the Foxes of the world, even though they came after we did, right? So some of the big players in the world are looking at us and trying to learn from us and trying to accelerate. And the cheating for me is about building adaptable models. You can cheat from your category, and so kind of getting to some of the strategies, or you can cheat from outside of your category. So again, I look at some of the guys on the call with us today, and I'm watching what they're doing. Telkom's moving into Telkom One and kind of moving into content and that kind of stuff. And so the nature of relationships is constantly changing. You would have asked us 5 years ago, if Telkom someone we would have looked at, potentially yes, but potentially not. And so part of the strategy for me is you've got to understand who you are, and then look at how do you get better at doing what you do. And the answers to that are not always going to come from a Sky or a Foxtel or a Netflix or a Showmax or a Prime or Apple TV. We've got to look at ourselves and kind of go, this is who we are. How do we do what we do better? And I think when we constantly do that, we constantly get better. We've gotten some great ideas from personal care brands, some great ideas from snacks. I'm fortunate to have come from the kitchen into the lounge, so I still have some great connections from my time in the kitchen, Doug. We can talk some of that chicken science a little bit later, but we're able to look across categories. And I think one of the most beautiful things that's happening with brands in South Africa is we are no longer kind of in these little clusters, but actually it's flattened out quite beautifully. And so when Doug does something amazing or Yitesh does something amazing, I've got to look at that and go, oh my gosh, how do we do that? How do we steal and kind of cheat with their cheat sheet and then kind of adapt it to who we are? And so, yeah, it really is exciting for me. I think we are also kind of at a place which is so exciting, where a lot of international brands are looking at South African brands and trying to understand how we do what we do in the environments we do. I think one of the things COVID did in locking down the world and changing things that to us come at us every day, the inability to access certain consumer groups, the inability to, our distribution systems are so advanced in our market because we've just had to figure it out. And all of a sudden, the international brands were looking at us and going, gosh, here's a group of marketers who do this every day like it's just breathing. And so for me, that's also really, really exciting about how I think we're going to see more and more and more international brands reference us as how to connect, how to solve problems for consumers, how to do meaningful work, and not just from a theoretical perspective, but from a fundamentally changing the lives of people. And at MultiChoice, our core values enriching lives. And we ask ourselves that question all the time. Are we enriching the lives of the people that we're working with and around? And I think when we hold true to that, we'll be good. And the borders become less intimidating for us. And then, I think finally for me, it's not to be scared and not to be afraid. We remind ourselves, I remind our team all the time that, these guys are, some of them are in the top 10 companies around the world. They've got these multi-billion rand budgets, they have international resource, but guys, we can. We've got something special too. And I think not being afraid of pushing the boundaries and seeing the world differently sometimes to some of the bigger players really helps us craft the category differently.
Thank you, Thabisa. I think that's very insightful. And there's a question here that I think is probably from the audience that I'd like to pose to Zukiswa. And it's from Candace Goodman. What do you think is the responsibility of brands in driving young South Africans to be vaccinated? And I think this comes off the back of what you were saying earlier on around, your organization being about leaving no one behind, right? And we've all spoken about the importance of making a difference in people's lives in different ways, shape, and form. And this is a very topical issue at the moment. So I'd be quite keen to hear if you think there is a role that brands should be playing in driving young South Africans to be vaccinated.
Interestingly, with the vaccination, I think the two camps, one that believes in the vaccine and then the other ones that do not believe in it, especially if you go through social media, especially Twitter, you see those voices. But I think the responsibility from the brand's point of view is to make sure that the right information is communicated to the communities or to the South Africans. I think from the telecom perspective, I think one of the biggest drivers, I will go back to the youth, is using social media, is using the online or the digital space to drive that education message, and also making sure that we communicating the right messages, because I think where we are currently sitting is having so many people, so many voices, and some of those voices are actually not relating the correct information. So I think from my side, it will be driving the right education. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. The next question is from Karabo, and I'd actually like to pose it to Yatish, I think. How can brands change consumer behavior post-lockdown without being generic or sounding like every other brand? And what I think is interesting about that question and why I'm posing it to Yatish is that the great thing about a crisis is that it creates an opportunity to drive change, yeah? So if there are behaviors that we think could be changed, ideally for the better, how do we think that brands can kind of leverage this moment in time to do so?
I guess, and in a way, even if you just dissect to a small degree the campaign that Nando's referred to earlier, right? There's some principles in there that I think you always need to think about, and we certainly really try to think deeply about whenever you craft an experience, right? And there are probably 4 or 5 things you've got to go through that are really important to bring. And because we sit on the creative side, often, a big bugbear on our end is, creatives often complain that clients don't get them. Sometimes it's the other way around, right? We don't get the business as much as creatives, as much as we think clients don't get us. So to bring those two worlds closer together, I think is where you're going to get behavior change. And it probably asking a few questions, right? The first is, what problem do we think we can solve, and what opportunity could we create? The second most fundamental thing, I think, is to understand how it works. And how it works means, not just how does the creative mechanic work, but how does the business mechanic work, right? How does it work end to end? So how is it easy to deliver, as well as easy to be received at a consumer level? Otherwise, if it doesn't work on either end, if it's too complicated for the consumer to engage or access, it'll break. If it's too complicated for the business to deliver, it will break. And then the third thing is obviously to think about what value is generated for all stakeholders. So there's got to be financial benefit if, of course, there's value being added in other ways. And so you've got to look across that value chain and go, like, is there value for this person? Is there value for that person? Is there value for that person? And if there is, everybody will probably do it, right? Nobody's going to say no to something that makes sense for them. And then the last part, I guess, which really then answers the question, is if it's done well. So if you do all that stuff well, what you'll be left with at the end of that process is some behavior. And I think it's about asking yourself whether then the behavior that's left behind is good behavior going forward. And so I think when you're dissecting your activities, your actions, your campaigns, anything, if you start to structure the thinking in that way, understanding that everything you do at the end will either leave or create behavior or not, you can then start to think of that as a lens through which to drive behavior change, I guess. Hope that answers it.
It does. It does. Thank you very much. I think it does. There's a question here that is actually for Bonolo, and it's actually a question about loyalty, right? So it's one thing to win the hearts and minds of young people, but what do you think is key to keeping young people loyal to brands? And so perhaps if you think about it in the context of, are there brands that you are particularly loyal to, and what is it that they do that has kept you loyal? Bonolo, if you're speaking, I think you're on mute. Okay, so I think Bonolo might be having connectivity issues. And so what I'm going to do is actually pivot that question and perhaps ask it of Doug. What do you think is the secret sauce to keeping young people loyal to brands?
Sauce, nice speaking my language. I think you have to and I'll come back to the thing I said earlier. And actually, I want to respond to the previous question as well. How do we change people's behaviors? Well, maybe you should change your behavior. Maybe instead of trying to treat the world as how you want it to be, you have to treat it how it is and adapt accordingly. I mean, we would far rather people sat in our restaurants, but they're not going to, and for good bloody reason at the moment. And so we'll meet them where they're at, which is tins for chips. We'll bring the food to you, and in so doing, you get what you need, and the kids get what they need. So I'd start there, and then I think if you consistently meet people's needs, and those are quite obvious in some cases and not obvious in others, and you change with young people as they're changing, then you display the same degree of loyalty to them that you would like them to display to you. So and this is a muscle, you develop it over time. And so, Nando's was quite famous 10, 15, 20 years ago, laughing at the things that South Africans laugh at. And there's a good reason, there's a good strategy behind that, because it's hard to be afraid of things if you laugh at them. That does give them some context. And these insurmountable, massive problems that we're facing at the moment, if you can laugh at them, it's the first step in the right direction. But we've kind of gone beyond just that. I think just this weekend, that we noted the passing of a huge Nando's fan in Dr. Cindy, and just to grieve with people, because we miss her too, and so we just put out it wasn't an advert, we weren't selling anything, but we were just saying, listen, we know with great sadness that she's no longer with us, and we did it in a way that's unique to Nando's. So there's some clever copywriting and wordplay, but nothing that trivialized the event. In fact, it paid, I think, great reverence to the event, and you can see people respond to that. And so, we're being loyal to the whole person, not just their wallet, and not just showing up when we want to sell something. And that degree of empathy takes effort, and you don't always get it right. But no one asks brands to be perfect. They ask them to be honest. They ask them to be valuable. They ask them to be consistent. And to change with them. And I think brands that do that consistently over time, and that's, I think, the true definition of innovation. Innovation isn't just the novelty of newness, which is normally crack for marketers. We love new stuff because we get bored faster, I think, than most people. I do. I think that's at the bedrock of building a better world, and the loyalty is the result of that. It's not necessarily the input.
I'm completely with you in terms of making sure that you are building a very consistent experience of your brand, right? That no matter where it is that people touch your brand, the experience feels consistent. And I'd actually then like to go back to Zukiswa, and maybe let's chat about that a little bit, right? I think it can be challenging when there are many different component parts to the business that you work in and the different things that you offer to the market. How do you go about making sure that there is always a consistent experience of your brand, regardless of where it is that they engage with you?
Okay, I think one of the things that we consistently working on as Telkom is the customer experience. sometimes we don't get it right. However, we're trying to make sure that whether you're using online channels or you are at the rank, for instance, through activations or at our stores, there is a consistent, or even the call center, there is a consistent exceptional customer experience. And sometimes, as I said, sometimes we don't get it right. However, that's one of the things that we are constantly working on, and that has been our focus. And yeah, I think, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So any discussion on shaping experience would be remiss if we didn't talk to the king of experience, which would be Yats. What's your view on answer to that question, Yatish?
On keeping experience consistent. It's a very tall and impossible order. I think yeah, look, it's, I suppose it depends on what on you first got to think about the things that are really important to be consistent, right? Because if everything is completely consistent, that means you have exactly the same experience everywhere, which means you have no real experience, right? Experience is also categorized by I suppose seeing new things, sampling new things, going through new things, and you can't have new unless things are different from each other. So I think that the fundamentals again are to think about what it is you believe should be consistent, and what those are going to be again related to the values you want to add, right? So what are the problems you're solving? What are the things that need to be consistent? So again, I'll go around the room and say, if you look at each of these brands, there are things within them that should be absolutely consistent and things that shouldn't be. So if DSTV swaps around the channel numbers, it's going to drive you insane. Like it will break, right? 183 must be this and 187 must be that. But if I switch on 187, do I want to see something different every time? Maybe. So again, I'm balancing consistency versus kind of novelty and freshness. The environment in which you consume Nando's, absolutely feels fresh and new, and sometimes it's art, and sometimes it's you sitting in sculpture. But you don't ever want hot to taste like mild and mild to taste like hot. And you get what I'm saying, right? So I think consistency is about first deciding the value you add and being true to what it is you think you're offering, and then making room for the ability to also constantly be, I guess, surprising and novel and engaging. So if you really want to think about how you be consistent, for me is again the wrong question, but it's how you always are the brand that people remember, but you're always able to give them, I guess, something new at the same time. And if you can find a way to answer that question, you'll create experience rather than be consistent.
Okay, so overall experience is perhaps more important than consistency in some measures. And so thank you. I think you've all been fantastic panelists and shared a lot of insight. I'd like to pose the last question to Bonolo, who's been able to connect with us again. And what we were asking earlier was really around loyalty. And I'm quite curious to hear from you. And it was actually a question from a Kathy on the audience. What is it that brands do for you that really drives loyalty?
I'd say reaching out to us and finding out what we want and actually doing those things in their initiatives or campaigns or whatsoever. Because in most cases, brands want to find out what young people want, but they don't follow up by doing what we asked for. So at the same time, it feels like these brands aren't really taking us seriously. We want to be heard. And I believe that each and every young person has a beautiful and colorful story to tell. So brands should learn to engage with us and interact with us, and also do things that we ask for, because that shows loyalty. we're going to tell other young people to look at this. Other young people follow trends, and instantly the initiative or the campaign would be something that young people want to be a part of. So I think brands should learn to find out what we want. In most cases, it's always assumptions. It's always what would they want, but that's not what we want. Ask us, engage with us. We have social media, Instagram us, Twitter us, Facebook us. We will interact with these brands because honestly, that's what we want. Just to put it in a simple term.
That is a fantastic way to end this webinar because it is marketing 101. Find out what your audience wants and then do something about it, right? Thank you so much to everybody. Nola, Yatesh, Zukiswa, Tabisa, and Doug. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you to everyone who joined to watch this webinar. I hope you found it valuable. And with that, we're going to close. Thank you. Bye.